Chapter 1. The First Encounter. The Uian Atlas, a deep space exploration vessel, drifted silently through the Lormac Nebula, its sensors scanning the anomaly-rich region for anything of interest. This was humanity's first expedition into Sector 79 Delta, a region largely uncharted by known civilizations. It was a mission of curiosity, diplomacy, and, if necessary, defense. Lieutenant Ethan Cole sat in the dim glow of the ship's canteen, sipping his usual morning coffee, flipping through the daily reports on his datapad. His job wasn't the most glamorous. He was a xenocultural officer, meaning he was responsible for studying alien customs, behaviors, and traditions. If the crew of the Atlas ever ran into an unknown species, it was his job to make sure they didn't accidentally start an interstellar war over a handshake. He was about halfway through an entry on Lormac gravity fluctuations when the ship's intercom crackled to life. Lieutenant Cole, report to the bridge. First contact situation. Ethan immediately straightened. First contact? That wasn't something he heard every day. He grabbed his jacket, downed the rest of his coffee in one gulp because nothing, not even aliens, was worth facing without caffeine, and made his way to the bridge. When he arrived, the usual quiet efficiency of the Atlas's command crew had been replaced with a tense anticipation. The view screen displayed a massive, angular ship, its dark metallic hull adorned with strange, glowing patterns. It was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. Captain Marissa Kane, a sharp-eyed veteran with a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded at him as he stepped onto the bridge. "Glad you're here, Lieutenant. We've got a situation." Ethan took a deep breath. "What's the status?" "We picked up a distress beacon originating from that ship about 30 minutes ago. No response to our hails until just now." Kane gestured at the screen. "They finally sent a message, but, well, you should see it for yourself." The communications officer, Lieutenant Jacobs, tapped a few keys on his console. A grainy holographic feed materialized in front of them, revealing a humanoid figure, their golden skin shimmering faintly under the dim emergency lighting of their vessel. The figure had an angular face, tall pointed ears, and piercing emerald eyes, staring at them with a mix of calculation and uncertainty. The alien spoke in a firm, commanding tone, their language initially garbled before the ship's translation software kicked in. "This is Commander Zalera of the Voran Empire. Our ship has suffered critical failures. We require immediate assistance." Ethan exchanged a glance with the captain. First contact with an unknown alien species, and they were already in distress? That was a delicate situation. Kane leaned forward. "Commander Zalera, this is Captain Marissa Kane of the Uian Atlas. We acknowledge your distress call. What kind of assistance do you require?" Zalera hesitated before responding, her emerald eyes narrowing slightly. "Primary power grid failure. Multiple injured crew. We will not survive much longer without external aid." The Voran were clearly a proud species. Even in distress, Zalera's posture was rigid, her voice steady, controlled. Ethan had seen this before: aliens who weren't used to asking for help, who saw vulnerability as weakness. Captain Kane didn't hesitate. "We're sending an engineering team to assist. We'll stabilize your power grid and provide medical aid to your crew." There was another pause before Zalera nodded curtly. "Very well. But understand this, Captain, our customs do not easily align with foreign aid. There will be protocols that must be followed." Ethan perked up at that. Protocols? Customs? That was exactly why he was here. Captain Kane turned to him. "Lieutenant Cole, you'll be leading the diplomatic team. Figure out what their protocols are, and make sure we don't offend anyone in the process." Ethan exhaled, already mentally preparing himself for whatever bizarre alien etiquette he was about to navigate. "Yes, ma'am." Boarding the unknown. 15 minutes later, Ethan stood at the airlock, suited up in his standard exploration gear, a datapad in hand, and a team of engineers and medics behind him. As the airlock cycled open, revealing the dim interior of the Voran vessel, he was immediately hit by the sharp contrast between their technology and his own. The corridors were narrow, lined with glowing conduits pulsing with weak energy, the emergency lighting barely keeping the space illuminated. The air was thick, warm, filled with a faint, metallic scent. And waiting for them just beyond the airlock was Commander Zalera herself, flanked by two of her officers. Ethan had to admit she was striking. Taller than most humans, with an air of controlled authority, Her golden skin seemed to absorb the dim lighting, making her presence even more pronounced. She wore a sleek, ornate uniform, its high collar and layered fabric giving her a regal appearance. She studied them with sharp, intelligent eyes before stepping forward. "You are the human envoy?" Ethan gave a respectful nod. "Lieutenant Ethan Cole, Xenocultural Officer. We're here to assist." Zalera's gaze flicked over his team before she gestured down the corridor. "Follow me. There is much to discuss before we proceed." As they walked, Ethan couldn't help but notice the way the Vorin crew observed them, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled suspicion. It was clear that humans were an unknown quantity to them, and if he had to guess, their culture wasn't one that relied on external assistance often. Eventually, they arrived in what appeared to be the command center, a sleek, triangular chamber lined with holographic displays, most of which were flickering with errors. Zalera turned to him, crossing her arms. "Before we allow your team to assist, you must understand something fundamental about the Vorin." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." She straightened. "Among our people, those of higher standing, those of greater strength, capability, and leadership are always given precedence. The strongest eat first. The most capable speak first. The superior lead, while the lesser serve." Ethan frowned slightly, already seeing where this was going. "And that applies to everything?" "Yes." She studied him, as if waiting for him to connect the dots. Then, finally, she said, "Yet, I have observed that among your kind, it is different. On your ship, when Captain Kane spoke, the females were addressed first. Your crew defers to them. In your culture, it seems that females are granted precedence. Why is this?" Ethan blinked. Of all the things he had expected first contact diplomacy to focus on, gender customs had not been high on the list. He rubbed the back of his neck. "It's not quite that simple. In human culture, we have a general custom, one of many, where men will often let women go first as a form of courtesy." Zalera's eyes narrowed slightly. "Courtesy?" "Yeah. Like, say we enter a room at the same time, I might hold the door open for a woman and let her enter first. Or if we're sitting down to eat, I might let a woman take her seat before me. It's a sign of respect, not weakness." Zalera looked genuinely baffled. "But that makes no sense. Why would you defer to those who are physically inferior?" Ethan's eyebrow twitched. This was going to be a long conversation. Chapter 2. Explaining chivalry to a warrior culture. The silence stretched between them as Ethan struggled to find the right words. It wasn't every day that he had to explain the concept of human courtesy to an alien warrior commander who seemed genuinely confused by the entire premise. Commander Zalera stood tall, her arms crossed, her golden skin reflecting the dim emergency lights of the Vorin ship's command center, waiting for an answer that, to her, should have been simple. Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose before speaking. "Okay, let's try this from a different angle. When I say we let women go first out of courtesy, it's not about strength or who is superior. It's more about social traditions and respect." Zalera narrowed her emerald eyes. "Respect? Respect is given to those who prove their strength, not to those who are weaker. You claim this is tradition, but to me, it seems like an illogical system." Ethan had to be careful here. He had encountered similar cultural differences before, but this was different. The Vorin were a warrior race species that valued power, dominance, and hierarchy above all else. And now, he was trying to explain a concept that probably sounded like madness to them. "In human history," he started, choosing his words carefully, "there was a time when societies were heavily structured around physical strength. Men were the hunters, the warriors, and the ones who defended their homes. Women were expected to handle responsibilities like raising children and maintaining communities. Over time, those roles changed. We developed advanced technology, weapons, and infrastructure that made physical strength less important. Societies evolved. And with that evolution came the idea that respect wasn't just about physical power, but about how people treated each other." Zalera tilted her head, her frilled ears twitching slightly. "So your custom is born from ancient tradition? A remnant of a past where women required protection?" Ethan hesitated. "In a way, yes. But it's not just about protection. It's also about consideration. Humans, well, at least in many cultures, tend to show small gestures of respect and kindness. Things like holding a door open, offering someone a seat, or letting them take food first. It's a way of saying, I acknowledge you, and I'm putting your comfort before mine for a moment. Zalera's eyes flickered with something, perhaps mild amusement, perhaps disbelief. So, by allowing the weaker to go first, you believe you are displaying your own strength? Ethan smirked slightly. Some people might see it that way. It's not about being weak or strong, it's about being considerate. Zalera let out a small scoff. Consideration does not win wars. No, Ethan admitted, but it makes living in a society a whole lot easier. She exhaled through her nose, clearly still grappling with the idea. Ethan could see the wheels turning in her head, processing what to her must have been a completely alien concept. After a moment, she shifted slightly. So this, chivalry, as I have seen referenced in your human data, is a voluntary act? You do not enforce this as law? Ethan chuckled. No one's forcing anyone to do it. It's just something that's expected in some cultures. And, honestly, a lot of people don't follow it strictly anymore. Society changes, people change, but the idea still lingers. Zalera regarded him for a long moment before shaking her head. Your people are strange. Ethan grinned. You're not the first to say that. She narrowed her gaze slightly. You would willingly let me pass before you in a battle scenario then? Ethan coughed, realizing he had walked into a trap. Well, that's a different context. If we're under fire, I'd probably take cover first and let you go next. Survival comes before politeness. Zalera's lips curled into something that resembled a smirk. Ah, so there are exceptions. Ethan sighed. Yes, situational exceptions. We're not stupid. She hummed thoughtfully, tapping a clawed finger against her arm. Very well. I will attempt to observe this human custom, though I find it perplexing. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You're actually going to try it? Zalera straightened. If I am to understand your species, I must be willing to experience their ways. He couldn't help but grin. Well, in that case, allow me to extend my finest human courtesy, ladies first. He gestured toward the hallway leading out of the command center. Zalera narrowed her eyes. This is ridiculous. Ethan smirked. Humor me. With a dramatic sigh, she stepped forward first, and for the first time since they had met, she looked less like a stoic warrior commander and more like someone who had just lost an argument to an idiot. Ethan chuckled under his breath as he followed. Unexpected reactions. As they made their way toward the engineering bay, where Ethan's team was assisting with repairs to the failing Vorin power grid, Zalera remained deep in thought. Ethan could tell she was still grappling with what he had told her, though she would never openly admit it. When they arrived, several Vorin engineers were already gathered, observing the human crew as they worked. The ship's energy systems were complex but compatible with human engineering tools, and progress was being made. One of the human engineers, Chief Martinez, approached Ethan with a status update. We've restored about 40% power, but there's a bottleneck in their energy distribution. We'll need another hour to stabilize it. Zalera nodded. Good. The fact that you have repaired this much so quickly is impressive. Martinez smiled, rubbing his gloved hands together. Well, that's what we do. Just doing our part. Ethan could see Zalera's expression shift subtly at the phrasing. Martinez, unaware of the earlier conversation, gestured toward a terminal. Commander, if you'd like to see the data, you can go ahead first. Zalera stiffened slightly. Her eyes darted to Ethan before returning to Martinez. There was a beat of hesitation. Then, ever so slowly, she took a step forward, deliberately going first. Ethan couldn't help but smirk. She was trying. It was an awkward attempt, but she was trying. As she leaned over the console, inspecting the data, she murmured just loud enough for Ethan to hear. This is the dumbest tradition I have ever observed. Ethan chuckled. Yeah, but you did it anyway. Zalera exhaled heavily. Yes, I did. And for the first time since they had met, Ethan swore he saw the smallest hint of amusement in her emerald eyes. A cultural exchange like no other. The rest of the evening continued with repairs and conversations, both crews learning more about each other, working side by side to stabilize the Vorin vessel. Zalera, for all her earlier skepticism, watched everything carefully, absorbing human interactions, questioning traditions, and, occasionally, making attempts to practice what she had learned. By the time the repairs were complete and the Vorin ship had regained full power, Zalera turned to Ethan with a reluctant nod. You have given me much to consider, Lieutenant Cole. Ethan grinned. I'll take that as a win. She studied him for a moment before exhaling. Next time, I will introduce you to Vorin customs. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Oh? What kind of customs are we talking about? Zalera's lips curled in amusement. Our warriors always take the first bite of a meal to prove their dominance. I assume you would be eager to try? Ethan immediately had a bad feeling about this, but he wasn't about to back down now. Bring it on. Zalera smirked. We shall see. And with that, first contact between humans and the Vorin had truly begun. Chapter 3. The Human Who Challenges a Warrior's Table. The tension in the air was palpable as Ethan stood across from Zalera in the Vorin mess hall, surrounded by the gathered officers and crew of her ship. The repairs had been completed, power had been fully restored, and in recognition of the humans' assistance, Zalera had invited them to share a traditional Vorin meal which, as Ethan quickly realized, was not just about eating, but about proving oneself. Zalera had been clear. The first bite of the meal always went to the strongest warrior at the table. In human culture, allowing someone else to eat first was an act of respect and courtesy. In Vorin culture, it was the exact opposite. The strongest ate first as a sign of dominance, of leadership, of their right to command. And now, Ethan was standing at the head of the long metallic dining table, facing a challenge he had absolutely not prepared for. The food itself was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. Large platters of grilled meats, exotic-looking tubers, and a variety of dishes that shimmered under the dim lights, their colors shifting slightly as the steam rose from them. But his attention wasn't on the food. It was on the challenge at hand. Zalera smirked at him from the other side of the table, arms crossed. Since you humans enjoy cultural exchanges, I assume you are ready to partake in ours. Or are you going to let me eat first? The murmurs of the Vorin crew filled the room. Ethan could feel their eyes on him, waiting to see if the strange human who had just lectured their commander about chivalry would now bow to their customs, or if he was about to make things much more interesting. Ethan sighed internally. This was what he got for opening his big mouth. But he wasn't about to back down now. He stepped forward, meeting Zalera's emerald gaze with his own. All right, what do I have to do? A flicker of amusement passed through her expression. Simple. You must prove you have the right to take the first bite. Ethan raised an eyebrow. And how exactly do I prove that? Zalera turned toward a nearby Vorin warrior, who immediately stepped forward, setting down a massive slab of meat on a separate plate, roughly the size of Ethan's entire forearm. This, Zalera said, is a traditional test of strength in my culture. Before we enter battle, we consume food that has been prepared through fire and steel. The stronger the warrior, the larger the portion they are given. She gestured to the imposing chunk of meat in front of him. You must finish this first before I may eat. If you fail, you forfeit your right to eat before me. Ethan stared at the absurdly large portion. This is an eating contest, isn't it? Zalera smirked. You could see it that way. But to us, it is a demonstration of power. If you cannot even out-eat a Vorin warrior, how can you claim strength over them? Ethan exhaled. Of all the possible diplomatic challenges he could have faced, why did it have to be food-related? He wasn't exactly a small guy, but this was something else entirely. Still, he had no choice. He took a seat at the table, grabbed the Vorin eating utensils, which looked more like small blades than forks, and prepared himself. All right, he muttered under his breath. Let's do this. The battle of the table. The moment Ethan took his first bite, he realized two things. First, the meat was actually delicious, seasoned with a blend of spices that tingled across his tongue in an entirely unfamiliar way. Second, it was spicy as hell. Ethan barely managed to keep his expression neutral as the heat exploded in his mouth, fire spreading across his tongue and down his throat like he had just swallowed a shot of liquid sun. He coughed once, forcing himself to keep chewing, swallowing the mouthful while ignoring the smug expression on Zalera's face. Something wrong, human? She asked, her tone laced with amusement. Ethan took a deep breath. Nope, just appreciating the flavor. The gathered Vorin warriors chuckled. Ethan ignored them and kept eating. Bite after bite, he forced himself to push through the absurd level of heat, his hands gripping the metallic eating blades tightly as he carved through the massive portion in front of him. His body was already sweating, But he wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing him struggle. Across from him, Zalera watched closely, her arms still crossed, her eyes sharp. Minutes passed. Then more. Ethan's stomach started to protest, but he didn't stop. More than anything, this wasn't just about food anymore. This was about proving that he could meet the Vorin on their terms, that humanity wasn't just a species of weak diplomats who folded under pressure. With one final bite, Ethan slammed his utensil down onto the table, exhaling sharply. The room went silent. Zalera raised an eyebrow. "You actually finished it?" Ethan wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Yeah, and I didn't even pass out." A moment of stillness. Then laughter. Deep, hearty laughter from the Vorin officers, their once skeptical expressions shifting into something resembling respect. Even Zalera chuckled, shaking her head. "I will admit," she said, reaching for her own plate, "I did not expect you to last." Ethan grinned. "Neither did I." She gave him a small nod. "Very well. You have earned your first bite. Perhaps there is more to human strength than I assumed." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "See? We're full of surprises." Zalera smirked, finally taking her own bite, and for the first time since they had met, the tension between them eased. Bridging the gap. As the meal continued, Ethan found himself engaged in conversation with the Vorin crew, answering their endless stream of questions about human customs, technology, and military strategies. To his surprise, Zalera herself seemed genuinely interested, despite her earlier skepticism. "You humans are an odd species," she mused, sipping from a metallic cup filled with a dark, thick liquid that Ethan suspected was some kind of Vorin equivalent to alcohol. "You are physically weaker than most warrior races, yet you have thrived. You rely on machines, yet you do not allow them to rule over you. And now, I find that even your traditions, strange as they may be, are not without reason." Ethan smiled. "I'll take that as a compliment." Zalera studied him for a moment. Then, she nodded. "It is." For the first time since the mission had started, Ethan felt like they had truly begun to bridge the gap between their species. What had started as a misunderstanding, a clash of customs and traditions, had turned into something much more valuable. Mutual respect, understanding, the beginning of a true alliance. As the night wore on, Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching as the Vorin officers laughed, debated, and exchanged stories with the human crew. And when Zalera turned to him with a small smirk, raising her drink in a silent toast, he knew they had won something far more important than just a meal. They had won each other's trust. Chapter 4. An Alliance Forged in Fire. The echoes of laughter and conversation filled the Vorin mess hall, a stark contrast to the tension that had once dominated the room. Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching as humans and Vorin officers, two entirely different species, sat side by side, sharing food, stories, and, more importantly, a growing sense of camaraderie. This was something rare. True cultural exchange. For years, humans had struggled with first contact scenarios, sometimes facing hostility, sometimes facing indifference. But this was different. This was the kind of understanding that didn't come from treaties or formal diplomatic channels. Came from something much more personal, from sharing a table, from learning each other's ways, from proving that despite their differences, they could stand as equals. Zalera sat across from him, her golden skin still glowing faintly under the dim mess hall lights. She had remained mostly quiet after their earlier challenge, but every now and then, Ethan caught her observing him, studying him in a way that made it clear she was reassessing her perception of humanity. And that was a win in itself. She finally spoke, her voice quieter than before. "You truly are an unusual species." Ethan smirked. "That's what I keep hearing." She tilted her head, swirling the dark liquid in her cup. "When we first encountered you, I believed your customs were foolish, pointless displays of deference. But now I see that they are not about submission or weakness. They are about something else." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "And what's that?" Zalera met his gaze. "Choice." The word hung in the air for a moment before she continued. "Your kind does not act purely by instinct, nor do you follow rigid traditions because they are demanded of you. You choose when to show strength, when to show kindness. You do not defer out of obligation, but because you wish to. That is not something I am used to." Ethan watched her carefully. This wasn't just about cultural differences anymore. This was about how the Vorin saw themselves. You mean in your society, everything is predetermined? He asked. Zalera nodded. Our customs dictate our actions. Strength rules. Superiority is law. We do not choose who leads, we follow those who are proven stronger. We do not choose who eats first, the strongest take what they have earned. We do not choose who speaks in a gathering, only those who have proven their wisdom may do so. Ethan thought about that for a moment. So you don't have the freedom to just decide for yourself? Zalera exhaled, her fingers tightening slightly around her cup. No. To do so would be disruptive. It would be seen as dishonorable. Ethan chuckled. Well, that explains why my existence is so confusing to you. Zalera smirked slightly, shaking her head. Yes, it does. For a while, they sat in silence, listening to the conversations around them. The room had fully shifted. What had once been a tense, skeptical environment was now alive with laughter and discussion. Ethan saw one of the Vorin engineers explaining the intricacies of their ship's propulsion system to a human mechanic, while another was trading combat stories with one of the UN security officers. This was how alliances were truly built. Not through negotiations in sterile conference rooms. Not through political maneuvering. But here, over a shared meal, a shared experience, through understanding. Finally, Zalera exhaled and set her drink down. I will admit, I do not often reconsider my views. But tonight, I have learned much. She looked at Ethan, her emerald eyes steady. Your kind may be strange, but you are not weak. And that is something I will not forget. Ethan smirked. I'll take that as a compliment. Zalera's lips curled slightly. It is. That was when the ship's internal alarms blared. The laughter died instantly. Ethan and Zalera snapped to attention, the entire room shifting into combat readiness within seconds. Vorin warriors were already reaching for their weapons, while the human officers activated their comms, checking for updates from the Atlas. Zalera tapped a button on her wristband. Bridge report. A sharp, static-filled voice responded. Commander, we have an unidentified vessel approaching at high speed. No transponder signal. Scans indicate it is heavily armed. Ethan cursed under his breath. Pirates? Zalera's expression darkened. Or worse. Without hesitation, she rose to her feet, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. All warriors, to your stations. Prepare for potential engagement. Ethan was already activating his communicator. Atlas, this is Lieutenant Cole. Do you copy? Captain Kane's voice crackled through. We see it too, Lieutenant. We're running interference protocols, but that ship is moving fast. Too fast. Zalera narrowed her eyes. They mean to board us. Ethan didn't need to ask how she knew. She just did. A warrior's instincts. Zalera turned to him, her gaze intense. You wanted to prove your strength, human? Here is your chance. Ethan grinned, adrenaline already kicking in. Well, hell, let's give him a proper introduction. A battle in the stars. The ship shook violently as the enemy vessel latched onto its hull with magnetic clamps, forcing a direct boarding. Vorin warriors rushed through the corridors, taking up defensive positions, while human security officers from the Atlas armed themselves, ready to fight alongside them. Zalera led the charge, her posture rigid, her emerald eyes burning with battle-ready intensity. We hold this ground, she ordered. They do not take this ship. Ethan stood beside her, his pulse pounding, his rifle charged and ready. He had fought in skirmishes before, but this was something else. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a test of everything they had built tonight. As the hull breach alarms echoed through the corridors, the first of the enemy forces burst through a group of heavily armored raiders, their weapons glowing with high-energy disruptor fire. The battle began in an instant. Zalera moved like lightning, disarming one raider with a vicious twist, slamming him into the wall before delivering a swift strike to his throat. Ethan fired a clean shot, taking down another before he could raise his weapon. The Vorin warriors fought with precision and power, their movements fluid and relentless. But the humans had their own strengths: tactical coordination, adaptability, and sheer determination. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for each other. As the battle raged on, Ethan found himself back-to-back with Zalera, their movements synchronized, a human and an alien warrior fighting side by side. A week ago, they had been strangers. Now, they were allies. And together, they would win this fight. A new beginning. By the time the battle ended, the enemy ship had been repelled, its surviving crew retreating into the void. The Voran ship, though damaged, was still intact. Ethan stood in the wreckage of the corridor, breathing heavily, watching as the human and Voran soldiers exchanged nods of mutual respect. They had done it. Zalera exhaled, brushing a hand across a shallow cut on her arm. She turned to Ethan, her expression unreadable. "You fought well, human." Ethan smirked. "So did you." She studied him for a moment before nodding. "Perhaps your ways are not as strange as I once thought." Ethan chuckled. "Told you were full of surprises." Zalera smirked. "Indeed." As the stars stretched endlessly beyond them, Ethan realized something. This wasn't just about one meal, one tradition, or even one battle. This was the start of something much bigger, and he wouldn't have it any other way.